The immediate goal of the extremists of theocratic Muslims is to control the Muslim states, is to create a worldwide Islamic empire again, kind of like the Ottoman Empire was. You have to understand, the Arabs in particular, and by definition now Muslims, they've never accepted what has happened to them in the 20th century. The problem is they still see themselves as a superpower. They had been a superpower for nearly 1,500 years. They never got to the point where they saw themselves as a third world people. They never got to the point where they saw themselves as just another weak country. They still held on to the belief, to the dreams of being this mass empire. They still have the dreams and aspirations of being an empire. They can't accept the fact that they're not a major world player. What is happening in Iraq today is a great example of what could happen to every Middle Eastern country if the governments was to abruptly be removed. Because there is now an underlying extremist movement in every Arab and Muslim country. Remember, between 1967 and 1986, during the occupation, there was relative peace in the West Bank and Gaza. There was no stone throwing, there was no suicide bombings, there was none of that. Israel made a terrible mistake. They did not come up with a political solution for the Palestinians. They controlled the land. We were under Israel's control, but we were not recognized as citizens. This caused a serious problem. You felt unequal, and it finally erupted. I was born in Bethlehem to a family from Jerusalem, and I lived in the Ramallah area. And I moved to New Orleans, Louisiana when I was 9 years old. I grew up there, basically. I grew up in the South. And I used to say Jerusalem, which of course Jerusalem is a city, and that's not what most people are asking when they ask you where you're from. And I remember one girl once said, well, you know, I didn't ask you which city you're from, I asked you which country you're from. And I remember saying, well, I don't have a country. And I remember she got irritated. She said, what do you mean everyone has a country? So that explains the kind of dilemma that most Palestinians felt, you know, living, for example, under Israeli rule. Some people's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. I don't make that distinction. I don't make that distinction. I'm more willing to call a person a terrorist than a freedom fighter. I totally reject the use of violence against civilians to effect political change. To the extent possible, I want it minimized or eliminated. I think any time you intentionally focus on civilians to cause them either bodily injury or murder to effect political change, that, in my opinion, is terrorism. So you naturally have a conflict between the United States and the region. There's conflicting interests between the locals, the natives, and the United States. Add to that the core issue between Arabs and the United States being the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the United States has clearly taken sides in that. And so the United States is naturally the recipient of all Arab anger. They have a role to play in everything, so you will naturally see the extremists attacking the United States. There's a lot more support for the use of terror than anyone is willing to admit. And here's the thing, if you talk to the average Muslim, they'll tell you we don't support terrorism. And they're telling the truth. The problem is where you define terror. The reason they can say they don't support terrorism is because they believe what they do support, something that I consider terrorism, they don't define as terrorism. I think what's happening in Iraq today could happen in every Arabic country if there was an abrupt change in the regimes. Because in many ways the conflict in Iraq today, yeah, sure, there are people who are upset that their country was invaded by a foreign power, and I understand that. They have a right to be upset. But I think it's also more than that. The battle in Iraq today is about the future of Iraq. Whether you're going to end up with a secular democratic country, or whether you're going to end up with a theocratic country. The only ones who can defeat this now, who can stop this, are Muslims themselves. We founded the Free Muslim Coalition Against Terrorism because we have an important message to give the world that's not being given by anyone else in the same manner that we're given it. It's absolutely necessary what we're doing. We think the world needs this. We think the Muslims need this to save their soul.